Thank you for joining us for this month's membership education session discussing Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ+ experiences. I'm Erik Stegman, the CEO here at Native Americans and Philanthropy. And this month's discussion comes at a really crucial time for our communities. After decades of progress shifting the hearts and minds of Americans to embrace the LGBTQ+ community, we're once again seeing the rise of a small but vocal radical faction that seeks us out as scapegoats and villains. Native LGBT and Two-Spirit people know this all too well, but we are certainly not without hope. There's an incredible movement of young Native LGBT and Two-Spirit people and their allies working in their communities across the country to reclaim the traditional roles our people had before boarding schools, colonialism, and other efforts dismantled our ways of knowing and the efforts of the government to assimilate us. Today, I'm excited to be joining our fellow panelists, Lenny Hayes and Rebecca Nagle, as we discuss how identity rooted in culture grounds us in who we truly are, and how philanthropy can support the ongoing efforts across the country to protect our beliefs and our communities. We hope you'll find this time together informative, and we welcome you to participate in the discussion in the live chat. At this time, it's my pleasure to welcome today's moderator, Steph Poston. Over to you, Steph.
Good afternoon, everybody. Steph Poston from the Pueblo of Sandia, a tribe immediately north of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Super excited to be here. June is a beautiful month here in New Mexico. We had our tribal feast day on June 13th, and a lot of folks came and relatives came for the Chaco celebration and the summer solstice. So super excited about the topic here today to learn more about this topic and call upon our relatives. And so I'd like to call upon first Lenny Hayes, if you can come to the stage here and just give a little bit of a brief background on yourself and the work that you're doing. So glad to have you here, Lenny.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I always like to introduce myself in my Indian name. My name is Tukawa Nahilita, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I'm from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate of northeast corner of South Dakota. I currently reside here in Minnesota. I am also owner and operator of Tate Topo Consulting. So my work is based on working within the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community, discussing all issues that impacts our community, and a lot of my work is based on violence prevention.
Thanks so much. The next person I'd like to have come up is Rebecca Nagle.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Nagle. I am a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you, Nat, for having this important event and this important discussion. And I'm here today in my capacity. We'll get into it. We'll talk about it more, but we're working on creating a national Two-Spirit advocacy, technical assistance, and resource organization. And so I'm honored and lucky to be on the board of that organization.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Next up is bringing Erik back up, Erik Stegman.
Hello again. Great to be here. I'm Erik. I'm the CEO here at Native Americans and Philanthropy. I grew up in the Seattle area, and my mom's family is from the Kettle First Nation, which are the Nakoda people up in present-day Saskatchewan. And I'm here in many capacities myself, but as an out queer man myself who's been working in tribal issues my whole life, I bring a lot of this intersectional identity to the table, but also a lot of the people who've been part of the community that are really finally bringing this national organization to fruition have been an important part of my family and community from different tribal communities across the country. I've learned a lot from them, and I'm excited to be in partnership with them as we build this new organization. So I'm really excited for this discussion today.
Yeah, thanks for those intros. As you can see, we have an amazing panel. Excited to get into the questions here with them. And so the first question I'm going to direct to Rebecca is, as we know, each culture and community hold different views and beliefs. We'd love to start the conversation by discussing your own experiences as a Two-Spirit or LGBTQ plus identifying person, especially on your own cultural teachings and how that played a role.
Yeah. So I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, which is near but not on the Cherokee Reservation. And so it's a pretty conservative place. And so where I grew up, there weren't a lot of queer or gay role models. You know, I heard things like when I was at church about how like gay people shouldn't be around children. And my family has actually come around a lot, but growing up, there was a lot of homophobia in my family. And so I think like a lot of people, I went to the East Coast and was able to find a queer community there. And then actually some years after I was on the East Coast, I found Two-Spirit community. And so there used to be a gathering in Pennsylvania once a year. And I remember finding that community for the first time and really feeling like, because I felt like back home where things are more conservative, I couldn't be out and I couldn't be queer. And then on the East Coast, I often felt pretty invisible as a Native person. And so I think finding that community was really just affirming for me. I now live back in Oklahoma. I think as a cis woman, I'm really aware of how much privilege I have. I think that a lot of the prejudice that still exists here where I live in Tahlequah, which is the capital city of Cherokee Nation, I think really disproportionately impacts our trans and non-binary relatives. And so I feel like the treatment that I get is sort of, if I don't talk about it, like if I assert the fact that I'm gay, it upsets some people or a lot of people. And so I feel like that's sort of what I get as a queer woman. But I think that there's a lot of prejudice, and it's part of the national backlash that we're seeing right now that is much stronger towards our trans and non-binary relatives. And then in terms of, what I have been told by, some speakers and by, some of the, traditional Cherokee folks that I have asked is that, traditionally, we wouldn't have had these, words like gay and lesbian, like, you loved who you loved, you're in relationship with who you're in relationship with. And it wasn't, like remarkable to be gay. I think the way it is in, our broader society or in Western society. And so I think even sort of as we were trying to reclaim these things, there can be a lot of differences and subtleties too in the different ways that our tribes and our cultures have teachings around these things. And so I think as we, use umbrella terms like Two-Spirit, that's an important thing to keep in mind. So.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Lenny, I will pass that question to you. About discussing your own experience as a Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus identifying person and how your own cultural teachings played a role in that.
Well, my story is similar to Rebecca's also. I mean, I grew up on a reservation in South Dakota and experienced a lot of homophobia, a lot of being ostracized and bullied because of my identity, because I knew I was different when I was at a very young age, and I didn't have role models to teach me about who I was as an individual. So in my culture, the word that we use in identifying who I am is the word wikda. And like Rebecca, I moved away from the reservation to Minneapolis and lived there over 29 years ago, and sought out the Two-Spirit community when I had learned of that word. And so going in and connecting with community and also learning from the elders about who I am. And one of the reasons why I am so passionate about this work is because I'm also a survivor of many different forms of violence, and sitting with the relatives, because I've had many opportunities to sit with our relatives who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, who they've told me their stories, their struggles and challenges of living on a reservation. And the thing that I've always said is that, culturally, when we think about the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma, this community was considered sacred. They were revered in the roles that they played in community. But because of that colonization, a lot of our people who identify have left their tribal communities because of the way they've been treated by family members, by community. So there's that loss of that identity, right? And so a lot of our relatives who identify carry the trauma of being ostracized and bullied and denied who they are by our own community and family, and it should be that way. And so that's why a lot of us leaders across the country who identify are really, really fighting in many, many different ways to bring back that cultural identity, that belief, that realization, even though we know that a lot of tribes are different, but they're similar. And so for me, what I always say is I identify as a Winkta first, because that's the word that was given to me by my people. Second, I identify as a Two-Spirit, and lastly, I identify as a gay male. So that's my way of decolonizing, my way of thinking, and taking back that word that was given to me by my people. And so I carry no shame in that anymore, even though, like I said earlier, I grew up being ostracized because of my identity.
Yeah, what a beautiful way to describe those levels of how you identify. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Erik, same question. Yeah. How are your own cultural teachings, how do they play a role in where you're at now?
Thank you. It's just always such an honor to follow Lenny because he's really had a really important impact on my life when we first met each other because of how I was able to really interpret kind of my own experience over the years. And I grew up in the Seattle area. When I was younger, we were in a suburb of Seattle. It was pretty conservative in a lot of ways. I suffered a lot of the same bullying and other kinds of treatment that I think a lot of people in rural suburbs, rural areas face, but there were very few native people. And while I was kind of going through the journey of eventually coming out when I was 16, um, my native identity and my queer identity were such separate worlds because I never had a connection between them, even though, I grew up with my grandfather inspiring me about to go serve tribes. And that was what I wanted to do since I was very young. And I was part of the urban Indian community in Seattle. It always felt like, oh, yeah, but I'm also gay. And then when I came out, I got very heavily involved in the safe schools movement because schools really mattered a lot to me in figuring out how we can create safe spaces for students. And so I did a lot of organizing gay straight alliances around Washington State and started to meet some of the other Native queer identifying kids or LGBT identifying kids who did not have access to any of these communities or knowledge about their cultural teachings either. And so as I've kind of journeyed through that in my life, it's been really important for me as I've started to meet more of those communities. When I got to LA for college and then eventually I stayed for law school, I connected with a lot of the urban Two-Spirit community there. And that's how I started to really get to understand everything that I didn't know. And my story is very typical of a lot of us who are urban. My great grandfather ran away from his boarding school and went back only a couple of times because of all the trauma that was there. And he ended up in Chicago. My family ended up here. I grew up not having access to any of those teachings, language, other parts of culture, certainly not the traditional roles that someone like me would have potentially identified as my culture. So part of why, people like Lenny, when I met him working at the Center for Native American Youth originally, really gave me a lot to reflect on was just thinking about what I want my journey to be from here and how those identities should be together in a place that makes that matches sort of how I really walk in what feels like two worlds right now. So it's been a really important and impactful journey for me, and I'm just really excited that we're continuing to work together to create this kind of community and space.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing the different aspects and really giving our audience a sense for people who were raised on the reservation and off, but still yet a lot of the similarities exist of those experiences. So thank you for those different perspectives, each of you. So the next question, as we've already discussed, some cultures celebrate and accept our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit relatives, while others do not. As Indigenous peoples whose identities are rooted in our culture, this also means that some people must choose between being connected to their culture or going elsewhere to find the acceptance and support they need and deserve. Can you share with us examples or experiences that you've seen have successes in keeping our people rooted in their communities while also providing the support they need as a Two-Spirit LGBTQ identifying person? And I'll start with Lenny.
Wow, that's a really, really big question. But one of the things that I think is really important for us, and basically in the work that I do, I really address a lot of the violence that occurs within our community, and basically, and the other thing that I talk about is getting reminded by my good friend and colleague Elton that there's also good things happening in our community, right? So. I want to do a shout out to the first and longest running Bates powwow that occurs in February of every year. I remember the first time that I went several years ago and just feeling very emotional in the fact that I was around so many people who identified as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ. So I took a lot of pride in that and actually became very teary-eyed when I was a part of the grand entry. So that's very powerful. And then I just, really want to do a shout out to the Montana Two-Spirit gathering, which happens every year in August also. And I remember going to that event for the first time and being connected and really seeing how much of our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ elders and community were very connected to that culture and that spirituality. One thing, the cultural events that they had every morning to get our day started, and other activities to support us as individuals, because a lot of us are still trying to really explore and identify who we are, right? We're sort of breaking away from that trauma that was impacted on us, right? And so my other understanding too also is that, we have over 30 plus Two-Spirit societies in the country. One of the things that I'm really enjoying seeing right now is that we're having Two-Spirit powwows pop up all over the country, which is amazing. And I also want to do a shout out to SWIC. They're formerly known as the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, based in Arizona. Leanne Guy is the executive director. But I want to do a shout out to her because she was actually the first one of our tribal coalitions that actually really wanted to address that being inclusive to the community, but also to address a lot of the violence that has occurred in our community. So, and I've been a part of the Two-Spirit Advisory Council since 2015, and have seen this movement really grow. So again, I mean, there's a lot of good things that are happening in our community and something to be very proud about, because when I think about this 10, 15 years ago, when I was struggling with my own identity, I didn't see any of this that's happening today. And so it makes me very proud, but I also think it's really, important to really address the elders in our community who have been here before us. One that I always think of is Marlon Fixico, who was also part of our advisory council, but he passed away last year. And so just remembering a lot of the teachings that he gave me in regards to really addressing the violence that occurs in our community. He was also a survivor of many forms of violence. And one of the things that I carry today is just that ability to recognize that it's okay to love and to be loved. because he was one person that was always addressing, or he would always say to you when he left your presence was, "I love you." And it's not shameful to be loved, right? So I really like to address all of our elders, like Clyde Hall out and the Shoshone Bannock tribe, Beverly Little Thunder, and all these elders who have paved the way for me to be able to stand up and address a lot of the issues that really impacts our community. And I'm just really proud of our advisory council. Elton Noswood, Josie Raffiato, Misty, Maddie Jim, who is also a very strong Native woman who has done a lot for her community. So I just want to do a shout out to all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think it's important to recognize the work of those that have come before us. But a lot of the names I recognize it because they're right here in Albuquerque. So really glad to know some of them too. So thank you for that. Erik, can you share with us some examples of successes in keeping our people rooted in their communities while also providing the support they need?
Yeah, those are such good examples. I think one of the things that I'm most committed to and have been in my whole career is just the role of our young people. In my last position, I ran the Center for Native American Youth and had the honor to work with a national network of our young leaders to co-create leadership development platforms and advocacy platforms. And I grew up as a student leader myself, and that is one of the things that has inspired me the most, especially in just the recent couple of decades, is just how vital our young people are to this work, and especially the intergenerational piece of this. So much of this is about trying to relearn and to restore these cultural practices, but also to, as Lenny said, to help some of our community members and relatives work through some of the trauma and violence that they've experienced in identifying this way. And our young people are so vital to that because they're the ones out there starting some incredible language revitalization programs. They're starting new Two-Spirit networks and societies. They're having one-on-one dialogues with the elders who remember some of these teachings. And that's one of the reasons that the center, the new national center that we're getting off the ground, really is going to have the intergenerational voice centered in it. We have youth board members who are part of our inaugural board, like Misty. And I think that piece to me is one of the things that just gives me the most hope, because it's connected to so much of the other rebuilding and restoration work that's going on across the country. And for me, that's really the medicine that's going to take us to a new place. And a lot of what you're seeing right now, I feel like, is only the beginning, because you just have to talk to some of these young leaders and see what they're building to know that we're heading in the right direction. And it's just really inspiring. So I'm excited that we'll have a new national platform to support them as well.
Yeah, I think that work with the youth is very powerful. And I think it's great that they have folks that they can look up to and know that there's a better tomorrow. And certainly the work that you're doing inspires them as well to continue to press forward. Becca, I'd like to move that question to you. Successes in keeping our people rooted in their communities so they get the support they need, identifying as LGBTQ.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so great to hear from Lenny and Erik and the feedback that they had. A story I wanted to share, as it's been told by some of our elders who helped do it, like Beverly Little Thunder, Marlon, and Clyde, was the word Two-Spirit's actually relatively new. So folks created it in the 1990s. And it was in response to actually a term that anthropologists were using when they were talking about, what we would now call like LGBTQ people, but they were, coming in and studying Native communities and looking at historical documents. And they were using a word that in Prussian means like prostitute, to talk about a lot of what we would call, like in Western society, trans women. And people felt like that was really derogatory of the way these like white researchers were talking about our communities. And so in the 90s, some of our elders came together and they were like, we need our own term and we need our own language for this. And so that's actually where where the term Two-Spirit came from. And I think, like we said, all of our tribes have different words, and sort of our own teachings about, what role, folks that we would call LGBTQ and, Western society, like what they were in our communities. But I think what that umbrella term has allowed us to do is to really organize and to come together and to create these spaces. And I'll just share a little story from my own life. I was living on the East Coast, and I got invited to this Two-Spirit gathering, and I went up there, and it was my first time being like with, Native queer community. Like, I didn't even know that was like a thing that I could have, and the drum that was there is from Oklahoma, is, the family that keeps it, the head singer is Cherokee, and they're actually from really close to where like my family's allotment land is and where my family is from. And so, there on the East Coast, I sort of met, these folks from Oklahoma, and they've done work for decades here in Oklahoma in a very like conservative place, to create space for Two-Spirit people. And so there used to be gatherings, they have the drum, they travel with the drum, they do a lot. And so I think what we have in our communities is a lot of people giving back, a lot, like just an incredible amount of grassroots organizing. I like when we were in Baltimore at the Urban Indian Center, I mean, we used to just have potlucks, and we like organize in the Pride Parade. Like I'm marching in the Pride Parade with the Two-Spirit group tomorrow or Saturday in Tulsa. And, and that's just like stuff that people threw together. And so I think that there are a lot of people, even in conservative places like Oklahoma, organizing those spaces. And I know we're supposed to focus on strength, but I just want to add, I think like the challenge that a lot of those efforts have is sustainability, right? And so like that a lot of this stuff, it can't happen for free. People are all volunteers, are all just kind of doing it, on a shoestring. And so that gathering on the East Coast, it happened for a long time, and it used to be really big, and it doesn't happen anymore. And I think one of those, and you see that kind of these groups get started and they have a lot of momentum, but it's hard for people to sustain them. And so I am hoping that that's one of the things that the national organizations can do, is to help make some of those really, really important efforts, have more access to resources.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, it feels like there's more events that happen on a regular basis, and it's not so much, like you called it earlier, remarkable, that it's just part of who we are anymore, and how we do better by our relatives. So thank you for that. So last week, Indian country was just on fire in all the positive ways about the decision on the Holland versus Bracken, which upheld Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'd like to, you have an incredible journalism background, Rebecca. If you can can you share your thoughts on why the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, is important to the LGBTQ plus people in our tribal communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So for people who don't know, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or a lot of times people call it ICWA, was passed in 1978 after a big national survey found that between a quarter and a third of all Native kids had been removed from their families and their tribes. And what the law does is basically make it more difficult to separate Native kids from their families. And so there was a very concerted effort from special groups to try to unravel the Indian Child Welfare Act as a way to also unravel tribal sovereignty and the rights of Indigenous nations in this country. That effort got all the way to the Supreme Court, and it failed. So ICWA stood, and the Supreme Court kind of rejected this invitation to not only get rid of ICWA, but to kind of rewrite some of the foundations of, the relationship between the U.S. federal government and Indigenous nations. So that was a huge sigh of relief. And I think once we finish, with that sigh of relief, I think it's time to kind of look around and look at how Native kids are doing in foster care. And so I think from my reporting, I think we all are sort of like, oh, foster care, isn't great. And when you get into it, it's really awful. Like what kids are going through in the national foster care system is really bad. And that's why ICWA is a really important protection. One of the things that it does is it prioritizes placing kids with extended relatives. And with the layer of, I think, racism that a lot of our foster youth experience, there's also a lot of research that shows that LGBTQ youth in foster care also have experience a lot of hardships in the foster care system. And so I think, that's important to keep in mind while we think about, both upholding ICWA and then also working with states and child welfare agencies to really follow it and really follow, the spirit of the law. And so I think that that's an intersection that I think is important for us to talk about sort of how not only Native youth are doing in foster care, but, Native LGBTQ youth as well.
Yeah, thanks for that insight. Lenny, would you like to follow up on that?
Sure. So, I was quite happy that what happened last week also. But one of my struggles and challenges over the years was the fact that often our youth who identified as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ weren't often a part of that conversation when in regards to ICWA. So I remember 3 years ago, and we know that NICWA has been around for quite a number of years, right? So it was basically 3 or 4 years ago through my own personal advocacy, because I am a survivor of the foster care system. And that's one of the things that I had seen was that a lot of our youth who identified weren't part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So I was quite happy through my own advocacy that 4 years ago that I and Sandy Whitehawk were actually one of the first individuals to actually do a presentation on Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ identity. And so my question has always been is why did it take so long for ICWA to allow us to be a part of the conversation, right? And so that's where a lot of my own personal advocacy work is just because of my own personal experiences, but also just really advocating for our youth who identify. And it has changed, most recently, which is good, right? But we're still having to educate and bring awareness to our own tribal communities about the many, many issues that impacts our youth, our adults, our elders. And we got these heavy, heavy subjects that are really impacting us, like sex and human trafficking, missing and murdered, which for me, I'm a very strong advocate when it comes to that work. Because I feel sometimes that stuff isn't addressed. And the other struggle and challenge that we also have too is the reality that when data is collected of individuals like us, the proper questions aren't being asked. And so a lot of our tribal communities don't want to address that our youth are being impacted by sex and human trafficking. Through my own experience, I know that 51% of boys who identify as gay are being trafficked at a national level. And so we need to start addressing those issues. And one of the things that I always say to tribal communities when I go and do trainings is that if we're going to heal as people, we need to not only just focus on one gender, we need to focus on all our genders in our community, which includes females, males, and our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ individuals. So thank you.
Yeah, I think you bring up really two good, important pieces. And I mean, I've been an advocate as well, and you think you're covering all the bases and making sure it's an inclusive, safe space. But I mean, the simple things like what are the right questions to ask and inviting those that are most impacted to the table, like the youth. So thanks for that feedback and that insight, and to make sure that those are part of going forward. As advocates, we consider all angles. So thank you for that. Erik, your thoughts on last week's decision on ICWA?
Yeah, well, like so many, it was a really emotional day. I was literally on my way to the airport and ended up having to grab a bunch of tissues to get on the plane because I was kind of an emotional wreck in all the right ways. I think to kind of connect to some of the comments here, the thing about the Indian Child Welfare Act is that it was passed after a movement of our own people got it passed, and it was one of the first pieces of legislation that actually created a North Star for the child welfare system that was about
Mhm.
restoring families and communities. And every major child welfare organization in the country has backed this for generations, because it was a forward-looking law that was about protecting children, restoring those families and communities, and thinking about how to restore the damage that these systems can do. And I think, one of the things that's so exciting for me is that we have been defending just that law to try to get to that place. And now we can get back to the business of a lot of what Lenny was talking about, which is about how do we improve these systems? How do we make them work better for LGBT, Two-Spirit young people? Because when we're having to spend so much of our time and energy defending what we already passed in the 70s, it takes a lot of energy. And now we can be doing a lot more of this, thinking about how the communities see themselves in these systems moving forward. So for me, that's the biggest takeaway, is just that I hope that we can do a lot more looking forward and nurturing positive, safe atmospheres that are all about cultural connection and family again, and not just constantly having to defend these laws against attacks. So we're really, really grateful for that.
Yeah, I really like that perspective on being able to focus on, what's possible for the future rather than spending all that energy and time and resources that could be spent looking forward. So I think that's a really important point. The next question, in addition to the attack on ICWA, there were an unprecedented number of attacks coming from legislative efforts affecting the LGBTQ communities, especially targeting our youth. So for Lenny, given the special focus of your work, mental health, can you share with us how you're seeing these attacks impact our communities and youth, and how you believe philanthropy can better support healing efforts of this harm?
Well, I believe that we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but just an amazing part with when we started doing this work with SWIC, basically it was just based in Arizona. But it was even hard to get some of our individuals who identify in Arizona to be a part of the work. And so we sort of went at a national level, which was amazing. But it was always our goal as an advisory council to break off and create our own national organization. And personally and professionally, I had always dreamed of something like that happening, because what I know of is, like, even though we're part of the community, the LGBTQ community, often we're not really a part of that community. And so, because a lot of our LGBTQ organizations don't understand our identity, right? And one of the things that I talk about in the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma is that for us, our wounds go much more deeper. And the reason why I say that, and I don't like to compare trauma, but it's reality, because we have to look at how historical trauma has impacted this community, where we were stripped away from any of the views of how we were viewed within our tribal communities before colonization. I always say that before colonization, our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people were looked upon as spiritual beings, but today we're looked at as sexual beings. That's the impact of colonization on this community. And so for me, in the field that I've worked in, and working with individuals who identify as youth, as adults, as elders, as community, and having, being a part of support groups, listening to the stories of what our people who identify and what they have gone through, a lot of times it's really hard for us to trust people. Throughout the country, I've talked to community members who want to go and seek mental health services, but a lot of them are afraid to, because people do have their personal biases about us. And a lot of them don't feel like they trust the system. Even from my own experience, way back in the mid-'80s, my own cousin was the first HIV case on my reservation, and it leaked out of IHS. And my tribe was trying to ban him because they didn't understand, right? And because of that, and because I hung around with him and I was emancipated at the age of 17, I wasn't allowed to graduate from high school when I did return to my tribal school. And so, and I say these not in a bad way against my own people, but it's that understanding of what our people have gone through. And so a lot of them, we don't trust. And so within our own communities, we talk about our experiences. We know what's happening, but when are we going to be invited to the table? I guess is my question to the people. Is when are we going to be invited to the table and be able to talk for ourselves? But I love the fact that we're in the process of creating this new national organization, because we know what our people need. I mean, we went out and met with our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people across country, and wanted to get feedback from them. What do you need? How could we help you? So I'll save that piece for later in regards to this new organization. I mean, it's amazing. It's a dream come true. But our people, there's a lot of struggles and challenges, and we do need the funding so that we can better train individuals who don't identify on how to work with our community. And to understand, I mean, they'll never fully understand our experiences, but just giving them that idea of our experiences.
Yeah, thank you for that. So for Erik and Rebecca, what are your thoughts on these attacks, the best ways to fight back, and how can philanthropy better support protecting our communities and empowering us in this effort? And I'll, Rebecca, if you can answer that.
Yeah, I think one of the hard lessons of the political moment that we're in this backlash is that when as the broader community, as the broader LGBTQ community, I think we really need to center the voices of the most marginalized folks in our communities. Because I think that's where the target started, right? It started with trans people, it started with trans youth, some of the most vulnerable members of our community. And now it's sort of spilling over to, people being upset that Target is selling, Pride t-shirts, and that like Budweiser had, like a trans woman on Instagram, like, promoting their beer. And so it has snowballed into this broader backlash, but it started really with more focused attack on trans folks. And I think because we hadn't centered that as much as a community, I think that's one of our lessons that I think that we can learn from this moment. I think that the other thing I will say is that I think it's one of the reasons why it's important to be doing this work on different levels. Here in Oklahoma, we have a lot of anti-LGBTQ bills. We have a lot that have gone through our state legislature. But we also have a lot of work to do within our tribal governments. And so, we've got 39 tribes here in the state of Oklahoma, and those tribes are in really different places. My tribe recognizes, same-sex marriage under our laws, but we still have some issues around what kind of healthcare trans people can access, both as tribal employees and then also just at IHS. And so I think that when we're thinking about the response to this legislation, I think within the Native community, I think because, we're tribal citizens, especially those of us who live on tribal lands, for a lot of us, the layer of government that we're interacting with the most is our tribe, and so I think it's really important that in this moment where folks are under attack and we're thinking about, okay, how can we add layers of protection? I think that work within tribal communities is also really important. We need to not forget that.
Thank you. So Erik, what are your thoughts on the attacks, and how can philanthropy better support protecting our communities?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this a lot. I shared this in our last digest to NAP's membership. Growing up in the safe schools movement, there's so many things going on that are exactly like we saw in the 80s and the 90s. And, there was a concerted attack by the right to start getting people elected to school boards. They had a game plan. They were working in every community, urban, rural, tribal, border communities, you name it. And what it took were a couple of key things that I think are absolutely critical to our Native LGBT Two-Spirit people as well. Safe spaces. One of the reasons I cared so much about gay-straight alliances back then is that it was a really deliberate way. Even if you had a school with one self-identifying queer LGBT person, to find allies and to create a safe space and to make changes at the school level. And that matters a lot. So much of what we're talking about here, especially as this new organization gets off the ground, is creating that safe space and community, because that's what builds that power to start to push back on this. And I hate to say, I think we're going to have to be doing a lot of the same things we did before, but at least we know what we need to do to get there, because we're going to have to, as Rebecca said, we've got to have our people advocating and drawing in allies to support us at the very local levels, but also at the state and national levels. We have to be able to join these coalitions of other people pushing back on the broader attacks on especially the trans community. So in order to do that, we have to have those safe spaces and that community built, and some of these new national advocacy platforms like we're trying to get off the ground here. So I think, we're going to learn what we did in the past, apply those lessons to the future, but it all starts with that safe space and community first.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit and heard a little bit about the new organization. So is that you, Erik, or Lenny, who could speak more to that new organization? What is it? What can we look forward to? Because we know that starting up a new organization is a big lift. And so if somebody can speak to that, Erik or Lenny?
I guess I get started out again. It just comes from the idea of our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ Advisory Council, the SWIC, that the idea was something that we wanted to do for our people. And so for 3 years we went, I just want to do a shout out with one of the foundations that actually gave us the grant money to sort of explore the idea of creating this national organization. And so for 3 years, along with Rebecca and our whole advisory council, also with SWIC, we started, putting this idea together. And one of the things, and we wanted to take our time on it. We wanted to think strategically. We wanted to be respectful to our community. And so often we would go into communities and invite Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people to just come and have conversation with us. So again, our thought was thinking about our community. It wasn't just about like what we wanted. We wanted to hear from the people, which is really important, because often sometimes that's exactly what happens. People assume they know what we need, especially sometimes when it comes to our youth, when really we should be asking people, what do you need? How can we help you? And we knew that a lot of these issues really impacted our tribal communities. And so the whole idea of becoming a national TA, so that we can go into our own tribal communities and educate and bring awareness. And the amazing thing is, like I said earlier, is that we have leaders, Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ leaders from across the country who have expertise in many of the issues that really address their community, like policy making. Someone like me who does mental health, addressing violence, all of that. And so with that, I'm just so proud of all the work that we put into this in the last 3 years. And again, I just want to do a huge shout out to SWIC for guiding us, Leanne Guy, guiding us through this, being patient with us, helping us, mentoring us, all those important things in the whole idea of creating this organization. And like I said earlier too, we know that a lot of our LGBTQ organizations wanted to be inclusive to us, but in reality, they didn't really have a lot of conversation with us, because again, our identity is much more different. Our identity is the connection to our culture, our spirituality, the roles that we play in community. And we're not just one word. we're thinking overall, we have over 570 some tribes, right? And so we all have our perspectives in our tribal communities and how we view these individuals. So I don't know, Rebecca, if I know you've been a part of this too, so I would love for you to say something, please.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Please add.
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. So, and Lenny really is being humble, but he and Leanne met at a conference, I think, years ago, and it was that relationship and a lot of Lenny's work that laid even that his relationship with the Novo Foundation that laid the foundation that's made this possible. So we really thank Lenny for all of his contributions. And so the organization now, I can just kind of talk a little bit about where we're at now and kind of what we're thinking about as we're moving forward. So it was kind of incubated by SWIC for a long time. And when we were as the advisory council, we went through a strategic planning process. We did a survey, we did community listening stuff, like all the stuff that Lenny was talking about. We wrote bylaws. We have incorporated. We haven't gotten our 501c3 yet, but we have incorporated, and so we're going through that legal process now. So we're still under the fiscal sponsorship of SWIC, and then we actually we put in a new board, which Erik is one of our members, and had our first board meeting last month. And so yeah, we're looking to hire staff, get our website up, put sort of all of those, everything from payroll to insurance, all of those organizational things in place. Like I said, we also still have to get our 501c3. And then the goal looking, once we're established and looking forward is, from that strategic plan, from those listenings, we heard a few needs and we thought about a few ways that a national organization could fill those needs. So we really want to help, we were talking about before about all of the amazing grassroots work that's going on the ground already. And we're not going to try and replace or, do over any of that work, but we want the people doing that work to have more resources, whether that's resources we can give people directly, whether it's training, whether it's building up networks so that people who might be doing it in a small rural community feel less isolated or have advice or people they can lean on. We also want to do training and technical assistance. So whether it's like violence prevention, people who are doing a lot of the tribal coalitions that do like domestic violence prevention, they really don't know how to serve our community, and they really don't know how to address intimate partner violence, when it's a gay relationship or when it's a lesbian relationship. And so part of our role we see moving forward is doing training technical assistance, whether it's in violence prevention or healthcare, in these agencies that our community is interacting with or needs to interact with to get services and might not be getting the best care right now. And then we also really want to build up policy advocacy and build up advocacy on a national scale. So right now, we're often left out of the conversation. And so, when we're talking about Native issues, sort of the LGBTQ voice isn't represented. And when you're talking about LGBTQ voices, the Native voice is just left out. And so we're really hoping by having those grassroots relationships and also building those relationships that we can really be a platform for advocacy. So that's where we're looking at moving forward. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of ways to get involved in that work. But yeah, and I can hand it off to Erik too, I think, who can add some really valuable stuff. He's really helped us before he was on the board. He also really helped us network with some funders and think about fundraising in this initial stage strategically. So we're really lucky to have him be part of the group.
I know we've got some audience questions, so I'll just keep it brief. I think just a couple of things to underline for our funders in the audience that I think are just so important. One, the power of how our people nurture each other, especially through nonprofits. So SWIC, was so vital to helping this get off the ground, and this is really a case study in how a Native organization can bring another one into the world that's going to do some great work. And as Lenny and Rebecca said too, the Novo Foundation was an amazing partner in this work because they provided unrestricted funding. They allowed the community building and the process to move forward, and were really integral to this. So it's just what we're always telling the funding community. unrestricted funding, multi-year funding done where you really trust community. That was all really a part of the genesis of how this has gotten to where it is now. So I'll kick it back over to Steph.
Yeah, congratulations on getting that off the ground. That's important to build capacity. Super excited for that work. Thank you, audience, for questions. We certainly would love to see all the questions. That we have one here. Robert Sturm. The question is, he wants to hear what type of support or action the panelists would like to see from non-Native LGBTQ plus people and organizations. Rebecca, I will ask you to answer that.
Yeah, two things. One is, I think we're going to share an email at the end. So if you want to, support us as we're getting this organization off the ground, we welcome that support. I also always tell non-Native folks to start off with relationships. I mean, I think that the best way to support any community, but especially in tribal communities, the way we really operate is through relationships. And no matter where you live in the United States, you are on Indigenous land. And usually there's also Native community and Native people who are still there and who are still active. So there's a lot of organizing happening in the urban Indian community. And then if you live near a tribe, I think that the best way to be a good ally is to sort of build relationships with the Native folks that are near you and, already in your community. But yeah, moving forward, we're, we still have a lot of building to do, but we, as an organization, we will really welcome that support. So thank you for offering.
Lenny, your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the most important things, like I've said previously, is that what we need from organizations and supporters is just really listen to us and listen to our needs, and to really understand us, that we're not just a label. We are people of connection to our culture and our spirituality. And through my own going out and educating and just having that understanding that, as Rebecca said earlier, I believe that, before colonization, we had no such words for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We had specific words in our language of who we are, right? And getting people to understand that. And the thing that I always say to people too is that if you're saying that you're being inclusive, ask yourself, what does that inclusiveness look like? Mm-hmm. And just having that deep understanding that we are of something that was very powerful before colonization. And so that's why we have all these leaders, these amazing Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ leaders across the Indian country who are fighting to get what we deserve and to be honored for who we are and recognized for who we are. And so, yeah, that's what I would like to say.
Erik?
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I think that's one of the things with this new organization getting off the ground, is that we hope that this is also a resource like Native Americans and philanthropy is to the philanthropic sector, to build those relationships. We understand sometimes it's hard to figure out where to start, how to do that work, but we hope that this will be a new bridge to be able to meet people in our communities, learn from our communities, to be able to dialogue, but to also get resources that you'll be able to share in the places that you have influence, and places that you can provide space for us. So I think that's one of our biggest pieces of the vision of this organization, is to be that resource to connect with us and to build those relationships. So
yeah, thanks for adding to that. I want to move on to the next question. Certainly welcome more questions from the audience. And if you plug them into the chat, we will, as time permits, ask them here. So the next question is, while it is certainly a stressful time for many, there is also new and exciting opportunities that need to be celebrated, specifically with the development of the first National Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit Center for Equity. Can you share with us how you believe a national organization can operate differently to reinforce the work we're seeing at the grassroots level? and how the organization can be poised to do work that we're not currently seeing on the national level. Lenny, I'll start with you on that one.
Wow. So, my response to that is just the fact that when we sat down and talked about this organization, the whole idea was the fact that we wanted to be a voice to our own community, because we do have a lot of individuals, organizations who are speaking for us, right? And going back to those examples that I gave earlier, especially when we're talking about violence that's happening to our community, or even when we talk about missing and murdered relatives, one of the things that we see that's happening at a national level, and I always say that our Native people and our Native organizations mean well in remembering us or being inclusive to the conversation. But what's happening is that we're not being invited to the table. And we see that in a lot of different areas of the work that we're doing. And so that was one of the reasons why, one of the biggest reasons is just being a voice for our own people and addressing the many different forms of violence, but also too really thinking about our young people. Because our young people, what I always say is that the young people are going to take my place. And so what I need to do is help to mentor them and teach them, because eventually I'm going to step away from doing this work. And I've been doing this work for quite a number of years, really addressing the many issues that impacts our community. And so this organization is something, like I said earlier, I prayed about and wanted this to happen because I see what my community is missing out on, and just having a conversation with all of our leaders across the country and saying, yes, that's what we want to see happen.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Erik, if you could also address that, how can this national work be combined with the grassroots level work to be more impactful?
Yeah, I think, I've learned a lot from many of the positions I've been able to be in working for tribal communities. I think a lot of what I've learned about being at NAP is just the power of a national platform. And if you're doing that well, you're building deep networks, trusted networks of the grassroots organizations, the tribes, the Native-led nonprofits who can come to you on one level to as a guide to help navigate some of these really complicated spaces. In our case, it's philanthropy, which is a really bizarre field. It's a foreign field for most of us because it's Western. And there's a lot of guidance that's needed for especially smaller community groups who are trying to figure out how to build relationships with funders and how to access dollars in the right ways. And then at the same time, that platform is advocating and educating out at the national level to all the other organizations and government players and others that we work with in those places of power and privilege that we sit in. So I see this organization, really being that national platform the same way. I hope that it's a place where we are able to really be in deep community at the national level together, identifying new organizations locally that we can support, that we can guide, that we can help. But then at the same level, drawing from that knowledge and those relationships so that we're able to build the best set of national resources possible to do that kind of TA and other things that Rebecca had highlighted. So for me, that's the vision I really have for it. And I think when you look at, the role it can play just in philanthropy alone, I get asked about this all the time, and I don't always have the best resources available that are geared toward funders, for instance. So how can this organization be helping do more of what we're doing here today and thinking through, other ways that we can help get resources to these amazing grassroots groups that are doing this important work in our communities. So there's a lot of possibility here that I'm really excited about that a new national platform will be able to be able to do.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, what are your thoughts on how we make sure grassroots and the national platform, we leverage that for all the right reasons?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to, just say, like, I think what Lenny said around how there are a lot of groups that speak for us, and so we really need kind of a platform for Two-Spirit people to be able to speak for ourselves, I think is really important. And what Erik said around helping, move resources, one thing I always say is, a lot of these groups are, just need the money for like a truck and a float, or like they don't need to raise like, huge amounts of money, but sometimes accessing grants and things is really cumbersome when, like what is in the field of philanthropy, a relatively small amount of money would like make a really big difference. And so we're hoping that we can be that bridge. And then I just want to add just sort of like another layer that is, I think, one of the things that this organization can do, but is also part of the story of how it came to be, is that, a lot of people who, there's a really strong grassroots anti-violence network among tribal communities. And that network has struggled and also has wanted to do better when it comes to serving the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community. And so, Lenny and other leaders who've been part of our group get asked all the time to do trainings and to consult. And so that was actually part of the reason that there was like, okay, like we can't just be doing this work in Arizona. There's a real need for it nationally. And so I think that that's another connection to the grassroots, is where there are already networks that are, native networks of native grassroots organizations that we know are serving our community, but either need to be doing better. And honestly, in a lot of situations, want to be doing better, are inviting us to come and help them do better. I think that that's going to be another one of those critical roles for the new organization.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to move into the last question here for our panelists. And of course, we will take questions from the audience if you put them in the chat. But in addition to funding, what does better support look like to you? Are there other resources that funders can also provide that they may haven't explored before? And Erik, I mean, this is your background. I want to hear from you.
My daily, yeah. One of the things I've really learned in this role is just how important funders are as organizers when they want to really help with something, not just in giving direct resources to different organizations, but, philanthropy is built around relationships. I think one of the reasons Native people actually really understand that part of philanthropy is that we really value how we're all connected to one another. And there's so many places that funders have power to lift up this kind of work and to give voice to our communities. If you're a member of a philanthropy serving organization or a PSO at the regional level, or an issue-based one, an education or healthcare, all these issues we're talking about intersect those. And many of you serve on those boards, many of you are members. Please come to us and help us think about where those spaces are that we can give voice to our Native LGBT and Two-Spirit communities in this work, because with the addition of this new national organization as a partner, I think there's a lot we can do to educate the field of philanthropy, but to also start to organize them around these issues and to help them build relationships with our local Native LGBT Two-Spirit partners. You've already heard about a couple of just amazing organizations that have been doing this work already in local places. So that's my sort of call to action with all of you, is to really think about this deep network of networks that we are part of in philanthropy, and how we can be partners together to really start to give a new kind of voice to this work.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to piggyback on what Erik said, I think besides, just dollars, one thing that is really helpful is relationships. And so one thing Erik actually did before he was on the board was help us as an organization network with other folks within the NAP network. And that led to some of our seed funding. And so even we've had another foundation that's helped try to introduce us to other potential funders. And so especially when you're a new organization, sometimes funders listen to funders in a way. And so I think when you're new and you're getting established, having that person vouch for you is really, really valuable. So that's another thing that we've seen so far that has been really, really an important resource.
Great, thank you. Lenny?
I guess I can't, really say anything because both, Rebecca and Erik have, said the things that I was thinking also, but just giving out a shout out to Erik, who was very significant in the beginning by helping us. Because, to be honest, when I started, thinking about this national organization, there was a lot of things I didn't know, and I didn't know about funding. I didn't know about philanthropy. And so I'm so happy that, Erik was a partner with us, and he also mentored us and taught us also. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So we're about to wrap up, but I want to make sure that if any of the panelists have any final thoughts, any last words of wisdom we'd like to share with the audience. Anybody? Erik?
I could jump in, sure. I mean, first of all, just really want to extend my gratitude to everyone for being part of this conversation today. I hope we've been able to share some of these perspectives and stories, but I really hope that you'll join us in the long term for this work. It's really important, and it just means so much to me personally. It's something I've been thinking about a lot in my daily work here at Native Americans in Philanthropy. But there's just going to be so many opportunities to meet a lot of these amazing people who are part of our community, and we're excited to keep doing that work with you. So just want to thank you for being here.
Yeah. So to each of you, I've watched your work, and so I respect your work. You are powerful to Indian country. You are courageous. So thank you so much for allowing me to moderate this panel. I've learned so much, like I always do at these sessions. So thank you so much. For those who joined us virtually, we're honored to uplift the voices and work of these amazing leaders. Please don't let the support end here. We encourage you to donate directly to organizations you've learned about today. You can also learn more about how to get involved by reaching out to info@nativephilanthropy.org. Evaluations, you should be receiving an email shortly with a link to a brief survey. Please take the time to share your thoughts. It only takes about 4 minutes, and it really does help us improve these events and make sure we meet your needs. As a reminder, this session was open to the public as a highlight of our member benefits. Native Americans in Philanthropy membership is open to our Indigenous relatives and non-Indigenous allies. If you are not a Native American in Philanthropy member and want to learn more, please visit nativephilanthropy.org or email Rod Jacobs at rjacobs@nativephilanthropy.org. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month for member education sessions, The Fight to Protect ICWA. Have an amazing day.